I would like to announce our next speaker, Amanda Gustin from the Vermont Historical Society. She's going to be giving us a broad national and international overview and context for the War of 1812. So, Amanda.
All right. Let's make sure this. Here we go. So thank you, Jess, for hosting this conference and having me here today. I should mention that in addition to working at the Vermont Historical Society, my graduate work is in early American military history, so I do have something of a background in this time period and its events. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today actually has little to do with Vermont. When Giovanna was putting this conference together, she and I discussed and thought it might be a good idea, if we were going to talk about the War of 1812 in Vermont, to know what's going on outside of Vermont, so that you sort of have an understanding of the international and national pressures that lead to the campaigns in the Lake Champlain area. And you heard a little bit of them, as Gary mentioned, that led up to economic difficulties and caused problems here in Vermont. So I'm going to do the whirlwind tour of the international and national context of the War of 1812. The military conflict that we know today as the War of 1812 is often considered to be America's most obscure and oft-forgotten war. To many, it feels like the mopping up action after the Revolutionary War. To Europeans, it's a minor theater of a much larger continental conflict. And after the war, though it could be said there were certainly political and social consequences, America's relationship with the wider world had not changed sort of logistically. Someone joked when I was talking to them about this, you know a war didn't go well when the end result is status quo ante bellum. All borders remained exactly the same. Donald Hickey, who's an historian of the War of 1812, called it a war that looked more to the past than to the future, and he made a compelling argument for the War of 1812 as the last of the North American colonial wars, which I actually think is a really interesting lens to view the conflict. It's the last of an older type of war and sort of the close of an era in North American history. So inasmuch as any war has a single cause, the origins of the War of 1812 are typically laid at the footstep of the American Revolution. In fact, many Americans at the time called the conflict the Second War for Independence. Here we are fighting the British all over again, barely a generation removed. It's difficult not to see an echo of that first fight for independence and some of the causes behind the War of 1812, so caught up are they in British actions and interests. The War of 1812 might also be said to have had its seeds planted in September 1785, when a young Corsican nobleman named Napoleon Bonaparte graduated as an artillery officer from the École Militaire in Paris and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. His meteoric rise over the next 14 years through a series of brilliant military victories and canny political maneuverings led to him seizing power through a coup d'etat in 1799 and then installing himself as first consul of the French Republic. In 1804, he had himself crowned emperor of the French people after conquering a decent chunk of Europe. Napoleon had a knack for recruiting powerful allies and then securing their loyalty through marriage or the strategic promotion of family members to fill key positions. He had come up through the army and he held the army close to him, secure always in his military backing, even when he may have been politically more vulnerable. And he's very much in the model of the old Roman emperors who had the army behind them, and he occasionally called out the image of those emperors, those Roman emperors, in both his mannerisms and his style. Napoleon's military victories are fascinating and heavily studied, but the details of them don't really apply here. What's most important for this discussion is that the so-called Napoleonic Wars created a global climate of conflict that influenced America and ultimately led to a series of decisions that brought America into the War of 1812. In much the same way that the series of short wars in North America before the American Revolution were symptoms of the more intense continental wars occurring in Europe at the time, the young United States, it's argued, was another front of a global fight between Great Britain and the Napoleonic Empire. European historians, or at least some of them, don't necessarily regard our War of 1812 as a separate conflict. I think some of them would argue that it's just another theater of the Napoleonic Wars, but we, of course, like to think of it as our very own, very separate and important war, which it is for America in a lot of ways. So in the slogans of the time, the war began over free trade and sailors' rights. You heard a little bit of the free trade argument from Gary earlier. Basically, the embargo of 1807 that came about after a series of orders of councils issued by Great Britain. There's quite a few of them together, but in American history, they're referred to generally as the Orders of Council. These were issued in part to reassert British control over American economic interests, and then ultimately, once the Napoleonic Wars got started, to sort of combat economic warfare being waged by Napoleon. So both sides are issuing decrees that no one else can trade with the other side, which basically leaves no one to trade with. Which does not end well, leading to, as Gary mentioned, the embargo of 1807. The embargo 1807, it's interesting to note, applicable to Vermont, hits New England much harder than it really hits the rest of the United States at the time. The South is still largely agricultural. It's New England and those important shipping ports, particularly in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, that are really losing the most business, the most money when this embargo hits. So they're particularly upset to it, which does play into that rise of Federalist power, that political party that arises very much in opposition to Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. That's going to become important a little later on. So what about the sailors' rights part of that slogan? If anyone escapes high school with an idea of the War of 1812 beyond USS Constitution and the Star-Spangled Banner, it's with a vague awareness of impressment. The practice of impressment had long been a feature of the British Royal Navy, and it was heightened in an era when Great Britain's major military advantage over Napoleon was in its navy, the finest in the world at the time, and I think you could make an argument it's one of the finest in world history. Impressment meant that British naval ships could draft men into service. You basically impress them into service. On the shore, roving gangs called impressment gangs could round up anyone who looked fit to serve and enlist them. Merchant sailors who already possessed the skills needed to live a life at sea and could actually be useful contributing members of the crew could be particularly in demand. And what we start to get once American ships start faring overseas under the American flag is that British Royal Navy ships stop American ships, often, in fact, almost always under the pretense of searching for deserters from the British Navy. There almost certainly were some deserters from the British Navy on these American ships, but this is largely a pretense because the British often rounded up American citizens as well. Some historians believe the number of men impressed to have been in the thousands. When sailors were impressed on sail, they didn't necessarily have a passport to show and say they were American citizens, and so they were taken regardless of their protests, even though American citizenship ought to have exempted them from another country's military service. And the American public started to take notice, especially since America at the time was virtually powerless to stop the impressments. It was a relatively small naval power. Although you're going to hear a little later about the early naval history, we don't have anything to compare with the British Royal Navy at this time and to necessarily protect every single merchant ship that's going out. The most significant incident in a series of confrontations over impressment was, as you heard, the Chesapeake Leopard incident, in which the British warship HMS Leopard attacked the American frigate USS Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia. British sailors bombarded and then boarded the Chesapeake, killing several sailors in the process. They claimed some of the American sailors on board were deserters from the British Navy. They captured 4 and brought them to Halifax, where one was in fact hanged for desertion. The incident caused a political uproar that President Thomas Jefferson could not convert into diplomatic or military pressure on Great Britain. So basically, instead, he took the route of economic pressure with the embargo of 1807. Not to be overlooked in the mix of turmoil leading up to the war was the disputed Northwest Territory and what it represented in terms of the American imagination and the American desire for expansion. Though the Northwest Territory, which comprised the modern-day states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, had been nominally deeded to the United States in the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War, neither America nor Great Britain accounted for the fact that the land was already occupied by various Native American nations. Unsurprisingly, as American population expanded westward, bloody confrontations grew more and more frequent, and many Americans believed that Great Britain was supporting and possibly arming Native Americans in their raids. How widespread British support actually was is still, I think, a matter of quite a bit of scholarly debate, but they certainly had interests in the area as it was a buffer zone with the British colonies in Canada. American expansionism has also traditionally been blamed for tensions leading up to the War of 1812, although there's debate about how overt those desires for expansion, specifically the desire to take over Canada and add it to the continental United States, so the original colonies at that time, there's some debate about how much that actually was a part of the lead up to War of 1812. Were there politicians with influence who wanted to fight a land war to add Canada to American territory? It's kind of unclear. I think some of them were, but did enough of them gather together to really make that a cause? And go back and forth on that. We did, after all, end up invading Canada a couple of times. And in Canada today, the War of 1812 is sometimes viewed as a war of territorial aggression. So whether or not we really intended to, we actually did end up invading Canada, which I'll talk about in a minute. The overall campaigns of the war were actually kind of poorly managed on a national scale, especially in early days, although you could say that we learned as we went along and that the later campaigns went much better than the earlier ones. And though there were failures of military leadership early on, we do actually see the maturing of some really talented generals during this time, two of which end up becoming presidents of the United States, William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson, and the third of which, Winfield Scott, is, in my personal argument, possibly the greatest American military commander in American history. He shapes most of American military policy through the 19th century, and he really gets his start as a young officer in the War of 1812. So it becomes a sort of cauldron, a creation for the American military. The war can really be divided into two parts, before and after the defeat and abdication of Napoleon. Before the abdication of Napoleon, Britain is not really paying a ton of attention to the United States. They have bigger concerns elsewhere. After the abdication of Napoleon in the spring of 1814, things get quite a bit more serious. In fact, I was just recently reading an article in the Washington Post called "The 3 Weeks in 1814 That We Call the War of 1812." arguing that some of the most important events of the war actually happen not in the year the war is named for. So roughly speaking, there are 4 major fronts in the War of 1812, which is a confusing war because there's a lot going on all over the place at various times. I'm going to talk just generally. The Lake Champlain area, which I'm not really going to talk about because you're going to hear a lot more about that throughout the day. The West, which we'll loosely call anywhere from Niagara and Buffalo all the way out to Detroit. This is a time when Detroit is very much the West. The South, which loosely goes from Maryland to Louisiana, and then the naval front, battles which took place across the Atlantic and up and down the North American shoreline. As you can imagine, from a war with so many varied terrains, types of fighting, tactics, and terrain, it can get confusing to narrate. We're not really talking about a clearly defined front, a specific line that moves back and forth throughout the war, like the Civil War or the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, that make it nice and easy to keep track of. The United States in 1812 was still a country bordered largely by British possessions and other international powers, and it's fighting on all of those borders. So war was declared in June of 1812 after a vote entirely on partisan lines. As I mentioned earlier, the Federalists are not wild about anything, really, that goes on in this time period. Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who's just become president, are vote for the war, and every single Federalist in Congress votes against it. It's so partisan that it, in fact, almost immediately gets referred to as Mr. Madison's War. This is James Madison's personal vendetta, not a national war. In one of the quirks of communication at the time, by the time the declaration of war had arrived in London, some 3 weeks later, British forces in Upper Canada had already taken up arms and were preparing to fight. And just a brief geographical note, until 1841, Canada is divided, the British colonies in Canada are divided into Upper and Lower Canada. Upper Canada is roughly modern-day southern Ontario. Lower Canada is roughly modern-day Quebec. I'm not going to go into excruciating detail about the unification of Canada, which is very interesting, but not pertinent today. For the purposes of the War of 1812, it's interesting to know that Upper Canada consisted of quite a number of exiled Loyalist Americans who had fled there after they were made very unwelcome during and immediately and after the Revolutionary War. Lower Canada, as you might imagine, is largely populated by former citizens of New France and is culturally very different from Upper Canada. Early campaigns in the war focused around the Western theater, as American forces led a series of invasions into Upper Canada that generally did not end well. In August 1812, after a failed attack near modern-day Windsor, Ontario, American forces surrendered Detroit, which led to the loss of most of the Michigan Territory. They compounded that loss a few months later with another failed invasion of Upper Canada, at this time near the Niagara Peninsula, and were defeated at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Although British Major General Isaac Brock, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in Native America, was killed at this battle. And I actually was just reading some interesting speculation that he may have been the highest-ranking British officer ever killed in an American war. So that's one distinction for the War of 1812, at least. The British Navy successfully blockaded most American ports in the early days of the war, disrupting trade and making the already unpopular war even more unpopular in seafaring New England. One important early naval victory, however, and one of the most famous of the entire war, was the capture and then destruction of HMS Guerriere by USS Constitution. You'll hear quite a lot more about Constitution later, but it was this exciting early victory that provided a boost to public morale and gave rise to the nickname Old Ironsides, as it was during this battle that a crew member was said to have yelled, "Huzzah, her sides have made an iron," after the Guerriere's broadsides had little effect on the ship. America's bad luck started to reverse in 1813, largely due to a series of naval victories on the Great Lakes. Americans, under the command of a 27-year-old Oliver Hazard Perry, had been building a naval fleet on the Great Lakes since the outbreak of the war, and Perry led a series of successful naval attacks that culminated in the Battle of Lake Erie, which cut off British and Native American forces in the West from their supply base. British forces were then defeated by William Henry Harrison at the Battle of the Thames, while attempting a retreat to Niagara. This led to American control of much of the Northwest Territory and even some of Upper Canada. The summer of 1814, however, was a dismal failure on one front of the war, which led to success on another front. I'll talk about success in just a moment. It has to do with the Lake Champlain theater of the war. Things go much better up here than they do down in the mid-Atlantic, so let me talk about the failures. As I mentioned earlier, Great Britain turns the full force of its military onto the United States in the late spring and summer of 1814 after the defeat and abdication of Napoleon and his exile to the island of Elba. Using their naval superiority, they led a series of raids up and down the mid-Atlantic coast. One of those raids led to one of the most dramatic and well-remembered events of the war, and part of that 3 weeks of 1814, as I mentioned earlier, the capture of Washington, D.C., and the burning of many of its federal buildings, including the Capitol and the Executive Mansion, which is not yet called the White House, on August 24, 1814. British forces arrived to a city evacuated so quickly they actually sat down to the dinner that was still on the table at the Executive Mansion at the time. A Baltimore resident wrote in reference to the capture of the capital city, "Every American heart is bursting with shame and indignation at the catastrophe." On a sort of interesting historical note, although many other buildings were burned, the Patent Office was saved when the director of the Patent Office, a man named William Thornton, rushed out to meet invading British troops and said, in effect to them, if you burn this building, you will be no better than the Turks who burned the library at Alexandria. You are destroying knowledge, not just a building, and the Patent Office was saved, although sadly it did burn down a few years later, not connected to the British, but it hung in there a little while longer. This is also an incident sort of famous for Dolly Madison refusing to leave the White House until the portrait of George Washington was saved and removed from the White House. I always had the image as a kid of her like bodily hoisting it onto her back and carrying it out of the Capitol, which I'm told is not entirely accurate. Over the next few weeks after the capture of Washington, the British continued to harass the coastline in the mid-Atlantic and all throughout the South. After a series of short skirmishes on land, the British Navy bombarded the port of Baltimore in mid-September 1814, lobbing just dozens and dozens of bombs and rockets into Fort McHenry, which guards the mouth of the port of Baltimore. Young poet and lawyer Francis Scott Key was trapped on board a neutral ship in the harbor for the duration of the bombardment, and he watched it throughout the night as the fort actually withstood quite a tremendous beating. On the morning of September 14th, he woke to see that the American flag was still flying over the fort and jotted down the first few lines of a poem on the back of an envelope. That poem would become The Defiance of Fort Henry. It was set to music later, and today we know it as the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. The actual Star-Spangled flag that flew over Fort McHenry is now in the collection of the Smithsonian's, and they have done a bang-up job of a recent conservation of it. And if you have the chance to see it, it is genuinely phenomenal and a really neat thing to see. Fall campaigns were largely in the southern United States, with battles in Alabama and Florida, a few additional battles here and there back along that Canadian border. And as I mentioned, there are interesting and important things going on in Lake Champlain, but other people are going to talk about those today, so I'm skipping over them. They're having it roughly this time. By this point in the war, though Britain could now concentrate its full military might on the United States, many of the economic problems that had led to the war in the first place, such as impressment and trade restrictions, had largely faded away with the end of the Napoleonic conflicts. So in a war, some of the reasons for the war have sort of just gone away while we've been fighting. In December 1814, Federalists in New England called for a convention in Hartford, Connecticut, at which they aired grievances related to the ongoing war, as well as their disagreement with the way the federal government had handled the war, and most particularly the economic restrictions leading up to and during the war. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and a couple of other states were not very cooperative when it came to mustering their militia for federal control during the war. Federalist support in New England was high, and opposition to the war was high. Just as an interesting note, that we heard earlier how much Vermont disliked the lead up to the War of 1812, as far as I can tell, there was only one Vermonter at the Hartford Convention, although all the other New England states were heavily represented. At the Hartford Convention, frustrations over the current war fused with older frustrations about the formation of the United States, including the Three-Fifths Compromise, which New Englanders believed gave an unfair representation to southern states in Congress. Some at the convention discussed the possibility of secession from the United States if things continued to go awry, but they were in the minority. This actually gets thrown back in New England's face when it comes to the Civil War, because if New England threatened to secede over the War of 1812, well, then it's perfectly fine for southern states to secede leading up to the Civil War, which is not the best argument, but they do have a point. Ultimately, the convention passed a series of resolutions calling for Congress to make it more difficult to go to war in the future, limit or even abolish future embargoes, and to abolish the Three-Fifths Compromise, which is something they're going to try again and again and again in the lead up to the Civil War. There was also an interesting resolution calling for presidents to be limited to only one term, and to force presidents to come from a different state from the preceding president, which is basically New England thumbing its nose at Virginia, from which the last couple of presidents have come. So thanks again to the slow nature of communication at the time, two other things are happening simultaneously with the Hartford Convention that make that convention not only useless, but ultimately incredibly damaging to the Federalist Party. They basically finished this convention and then realized that was a terrible idea. The first is the landing of British troops south of New Orleans. They traveled north with the intent of capturing the vital port of New Orleans, but were stopped by Militia General Andrew Jackson, who made a series of genuinely brilliant military decisions to lead a complete rout of the British Army. I have to confess, I did debate playing the Johnny Horton song, The Battle of New Orleans, here, to illustrate that conflict. If you haven't heard it, Google it, and you'll have it in your head for the rest of the month. Fighting took place from December 23rd, 1814, through January 8, 1815, with the climactic battle taking place on January 8th. Jackson's forces numbered less than half of British forces, but inflicted almost unbelievable casualties on the British forces, 5 times as many British killed, wounded, or captured as Americans. And this is really going to spark Jackson's rise to prominence, which will ultimately lead with him in the White House. Jackson's victory at New Orleans was the most impressive American victory in the entire war. And in a way, it's too bad it happened after the war was technically over. On December 24th, 1814, the day after British forces landed in Louisiana, the Treaty of Ghent was signed in Europe. News of the treaty ending the war didn't reach America until a couple of weeks later. What did the treaty say? Basic takeaway, as I mentioned earlier, is status quo ante bellum. In other words, the borders of the United States were returned to precisely what they had been before the commencement of hostilities, which probably did not make a lot of people feel great about the years of economic turmoil leading up to and during the war. In fact, there's possibly an interesting argument to be made that the causes of the war, all those economic difficulties, might have resolved without fighting, as they were largely caused by the Napoleonic conflict. Sorry, I mixed up there. On the other hand, there were clearly intangible changes after the war. Some historians have argued that the War of 1812 sealed the deal for American independence. If the Revolutionary War was America's creation and the years since then had been about maturing, the War of 1812 was America standing on its own 2 feet as a nation. Internally, the war shook up American politics, and after the Hartford Convention, the Federalists were never really the same. They faded away entirely as a political power in just a few more years. In one interesting note, failures of military leadership early on in the year, with a few exceptions, and the lack of reliability of militia during the war led to changes in the United States military establishment. General Winfield Scott, who had started the war as a captain and risen to major general by the end of it, thanks to a brilliant strategic mind, was placed in charge of updating the standards for the Army's officer corps. In 1817, Colonel Sylvanus Thayer was appointed superintendent of the United States Military Academy in West Point with the aim of reforming that institution, which had been founded in 1802. He became basically what's called today the father of West Point, a man who established and shaped a curriculum that is in fact still largely in use today, and made West Point an excellent formation school for officers. The War of 1812 also marked a turning point in America's debates over the idea of a standing regular army. There had been American opposition to the idea of having a regular federal force that was just full-time employed by the government as an army, because there was some belief that having that option of an army at call ready led to tyranny and was not appropriate for the new democracy. In particular, Thomas Jefferson was very much not a fan of the idea of a standing army. But the War of 1812 was the first in a series of conflicts that really made it clear, for America at least, that depending on the militia to fight all of its wars was not a good logistical plan. So from this point onward, the standing army would increase in size and sophistication, and the United States would rely less and less on local militia, although they certainly continued to be called up, and in fact are still called up today in the form of the National Guard. In Canada, the war brought about a sense of increased nationalism and unification, and though the war was not a clear-cut victory in America either, the years immediately following the war also saw increased optimism and nationalism in the United States. In a way, it's a war that both sides could conceivably claim to have won, although someone pointed out to me that merely means that nobody won. After he was elected president in 1816, James Monroe embarked on a goodwill tour of New England to soothe any remaining tensions here. While he was in Boston, a newspaper reporter dubbed the tour the start of an, quote, era of good feelings, which was a phrase that caught on and was in use through the end of Monroe's presidency into the 1820s. Thank you.